For many, the word city conjures to mind images of towering skyscrapers and impressive high-rise skylines in a lot of parts of the world. Skyscrapers are seen as a mark of urban achievement, a way to measure the prosperity of a city through both the literal and metaphorical heights it has reached. Take a quick glance at most European cities, however, and you'll be hard-pressed to find an example of the towering skylines that we typically associate with prosperity. Even though European cities consistently dominate the lists of global cities with the highest quality of life and the highest level of income, their buildings don't seem to reflect these heights, with Europe being home to some of the best-known cities in the world. Why is it that they lay so low today? We're unpacking the cityscapes of Europe to understand how and why they have come to be without skyscrapers, and whether or not it's all about to change a matter of time. It was in the late 19th century when the interest in building skyscrapers first rose to prominence, primarily in the U.S. cities of Chicago and New York. By this time, the majority of European cities were already firmly established, with many already existing as thriving urban centers for thousands of years. While a great deal of the cities developing in the U.S. during this time was the result of very conscious and calculated urban planning, the layouts of European cities were produced by centuries upon centuries of organic urban development. The old age of European cities, even in the 19th century, had a great impact on the availability of plots and land large enough to support the construction of these large structures. Many European cities still make use of the same narrow, winding streets that have stood since medieval times, making the logistics of large-scale construction even more complex than usual. While cities in the U.S. was pioneering the project of high-rise architecture, and European cities were largely content to maintain their centuries-old layouts to complicate matters even further. Many European cities rest on top of what is essentially marshland, makes any large-scale construction particularly challenging. Even transit tunnels prove a tricky project for a lot of cities in Europe, unlike in U.S. and Asia. They cannot be carved out from the ground, but inserted into the earth. The soft nature of European soil and rock bed make the deep, solid foundations necessary for the construction of skyscrapers an extra challenge. What's more, the cities that first pioneered high-rise architecture were experiencing population growth unprecedented in Europe. Paris, for instance, began the year 1880 with the population of 2,200,000, and 30 years later had gained around 500,000 citizens, for a grand total of 2,900,000. By comparison to the same period, New York City went from the population of 1,900,000 in 1800 to over 6 million in 1910. With such a rapid pace of population growth, it makes sense that incorporating high-density living spaces into a cityscape became a priority associated with the New World during the time that many cities around the world began to devote their attention toward building upward. Public resources in Europe were largely focused elsewhere. The first two major waves of skyscraper construction happened to coincide with World War I and World War II, during which almost all European construction and manufacturing capabilities were dedicated to the war effort. In fact, the unprecedented levels of destruction caused by the vast amounts of European urban centers during the Second World War played another role in why the continent has avoided building upwards after the war. Many expected the land cleared by aerial attacks and ground fighting to be used in order to modernize the continent's old cities and facilitate the construction of modern skyscrapers. However, the great sense of loss and unfamiliarity caused by the devastation of the war led to a preference for rebuilding things as they were before, as opposed to completely reshaping the landscape. Cities such as Dresden, Vienna, and Warsaw underwent massive reconstruction efforts in the decades following the war, with great effort to preserve the cultural heritage that had been lost. Regulation in the 1960s, as the focus on post-war reconstruction faded from priority. Some European cities began to dip their toes into the world of high-rise architecture. In particular, the Belgian capital of Brussels became the site of a number of taller developments that took place in increasingly gentrified neighborhoods. This first began with the city's preparation for the 1958 World's Fair, or Expo 58, for which many buildings were demolished and redeveloped with little regard to what historical, social, or architectural significance they may hold. Ambitious building projects began to sprout up in an effort to rapidly increase the amount of urban spaces for living and working, as well as streamlining transportation. Planning and development of these high-rises was altogether less fair and without pattern, and citizens and public authorities quickly realized that this lax an approach to zoning and urban planning was becoming a problem. Throughout the 1970s, environmentalists and preservationists began to lobby for the government with increasing intensity to do something about the rampant redevelopment of the city. In response, laws were put into place that restrict the demolition of sites and buildings that may hold cultural or historical significance, which greatly slowed the rate of urban redevelopment. And many other European cities have adopted similar policies regarding the protection of historic buildings. In most European cities are home to historic centers, and any plans for urban redevelopment give priority to the preservation of these historic quarters. The desire to preserve historic and culturally significant sections of cities have largely shaped the European attitude toward their urban zoning laws. Zoning is an approach to urban planning that practices separating urban areas into distinct zones, each with its own specific regulations for the development. The use of zoning is a method for municipal authorities to ensure that certain standards are preserved in different areas of a city, and can be a highly effective method of making sure that there is a balance cap between spaces designed for commercial, industrial, and residential purposes. Zoning laws in European cities tend to reflect the emphasis put on the preservation of historic centers and landmarks, and restrict the building of large modern projects to specific outskirts areas of the city. Cities such as Paris, Amsterdam, and London have all designated certain areas of the city in which high-rise development may take place, but they are confined to spaces that do not encroach upon the rest of the city. Canary Wharf in London or La Défense in Paris has particularly strong examples of the effects of zoning restrictions on the overall city skyline. In many European cities, including Munich and Groningen, historic spires serve as the limit for how tall any new development can reach, with anything taller than being forced to move outside the city limits. Zoning tends to come in one of two forms. Single or mixed-use single-use zoning is a practice more common in the USA, and is a method of urban planning that allocates a particular use for each zone, for example, purely residential or purely industrial in Europe. However, mixed-use zoning is far more common, in which each zone is intended to fulfill a variety of urban purposes. The consequences of mixed-use zoning tends to be a more even scale of development with fewer differences between the sizes of residential, industrial, and commercial properties. This more integrated approach to urban planning is another a factor underlying the flatter, more even skylines boasted by most European cities, a matter of mindset. Of course, culture plays another major role in the lack of high-rise buildings are seen across the European continent. Largely speaking, the parts of the world most commonly associated with skyscrapers, like the U.S. wealthy Emirates city-states and Asian megacities such as Shanghai and Tokyo, are technological pioneers that pride themselves on pushing the boundaries of expansion. It's no coincidence that skyscrapers emerged from what was known back then in Europe as the New World, as the structures themselves came to represent striving toward the future Europe. At that time, especially, was more rooted in historic class consciousness with a desire to preserve tradition. This priority is reflected in the taste of modern European architecture, with many viewing skyscrapers and modern buildings as bland and soulless. While the populations of Asia and Africa are booming, the population growth of Europe is comparatively petering out, with less of a fervent demand for new residential and commercial spaces to accommodate these rapidly increasing populations. The focus of European urban planning has largely focused on quality over quantity. European cities, particularly those in Scandinavia, Switzerland, and Western Europe, consistently ranks among lists of the best cities to live in the world. They are known for their high living standards, well-connected public transportation networks, and upkeep of municipal spaces. Sustainability and the promotion of urban green spaces is also of particular importance in most European cities, and keeping construction projects to a more modest scale lie at the heart of protecting nature and encouraging moderation and development. Moving forward, the attitude toward high-rise construction has softened in recent years with the ongoing globalization of the 21st century. And slowly but surely, more developments are being seen across the European continent. There are now almost 250 buildings taller than the height of 150 meters or 492 feet in Europe, yet half of them belong to just 3 cities: London, Moscow, and Istanbul. Some skyscrapers made their way into the Eastern European skylines as a result of the Soviet Union's desire to compete with the achievements of the U.S. But again, this trend has subsided since the collapse of the USSR. Elsewhere across the continent, Skyscrapers are generally restricted to major financial hubs like London and Frankfurt and are rarely seen in smaller, more residential cities. Whether or not shifting global trends will cause for a change in attitude and lead to an eventual Europe was dominated by high-rise skylines are yet to be seen. Global populations continue to shift more toward urban living as opposed to rural, which is set to have major ramifications in terms of how cities organize themselves. With this in mind, in a world that is embracing modernity and rapid development at an even more breakneck speed, the low-lying cityscapes of Europe provide a contrast where plans for the future is still made with respect for the past. Thank you for being here. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on any future uploads. See you in the next video.